In June 1941. And when my mother was 14 years old and her sister Frina was 12, they lived in Ukraine, the town of Berdyansk, if you see it there, on the northeastern shore of the Sea of Azov.
I was on my street. All of a sudden, after Molotov spoke, everyone cried. That's how we reacted to the announcement of a war. We didn't know what kind of a war. They have not come in yet. We would go out on the street to see how the trees are and the lamps and everything, because we expected we might see some people hanging there, and too bad, but we did. There were Ukrainians misled, mistreated to that degree. It was a horrible thing. So when I saw that, I thought, what will happen to us?
Had your family or any of your relatives heard the rumors of the Nazi atrocities in Western Ukraine? Had you heard those rumors?
Eventually, we did hear about Babi Yar. We had friends there. We still are talking about it when we are there. They take innocent people, learned people, kind people, and throw them all over in a big, big, deep hole. The cruelty is so great that it just, it gets reported everywhere, but it went on for a long time.
This is taken at about 1935. Now, your family is on the right. That's your father in the upper right. That's you next to him. And directly below you is your sister Frina, and then your mother. And to the left is the extended family, your cousins and so on. Your uncle believed the stories about the Nazi atrocities in Western Ukraine, and he planned to take his family east. There were about 135,000 Jews in Kharkov when the Germans arrived in October 1941. Your family, your uncle begged your father to go with them on the trains to flee to Siberia, but your family decided not to go, which is a fateful decision. Why did your family decide not to go?
Mostly because of my mother's health.
In the middle of December 15th, there came the final time when they rounded up the remaining Jews, 16,000 Jews in Kharkov were left out of 135,000. They rounded them up. Actually, they were told they were being transported to a labor camp. So all the Jews reported there. And when you left your home, what was the only thing that you took with you besides the clothes on your back? What was the only thing?
Something that I started to study just as soon as I could play the notes of it, Chopin's Fantasy Impromptu.
5 pages? And where did you put it? How did you carry it?
Yeah, well,
where did you?
I looked at them and I saw the stand of the piano was open, and there was only one piece of music there, and the Fantasy Impromptu was written. I looked at that and I said, but I cannot leave that. I mean, I was supposed to leave everything. There was no way I could do it. But when I saw that, I said, oh. And I went straight to the piano, right in front of them. So I went, took it off, folded it, opened up my blouse, put it right on my front and my stomach, buttoned up my shirt, and that's the way I arrived to America.
They were taken on about a 10-mile march, 10 to 12-mile march to an abandoned tractor factory outside the city. You have mentioned to me that the worst thing about this march, the cold was horrible.
Oh, yes.
Your mother's health was failing, but you said to me before that ultimately the thing that you remember the most is the humiliation that was visited on you by the German soldiers.
And the reason I couldn't answer.
Tell them.
The reason. The reason that I couldn't answer his question, because you were in the wrong territory.
not the first time I've been corrected. So you were set on this final march, and at some point, at that point, your father had finally accepted the truth of the situation. Even he, at that point, it dawned on him that the reality of the situation. You're not going to a labor camp, and that describe the moment, how you escaped, the moment you escaped, and how that happened.
Well, when my father realized what was going on, then he wanted to save his children, the two children. Well, when my father got that idea that they were going to kill us too, he couldn't take that. And he turned to me. He was my father, me, my mother, and then my sister. And my father looked at me and said, you know what? You should get out. And I just looked at him. He said, just listen to me. So he goes and he touches the Ukrainian collaborator with the Germans, Ukrainian young fellow with a rifle on him, thinking Russian and English. When he saw him, he said, listen. He said, you see, I'm not a Jew. He says to him, I'm not a Jew. Our children, you can see, they're really not Jewish. He was trying to make him feel that he's not going to lose much because, you know, that we are not Jews and he should save us. And he didn't say anything. So my father pulled out his one treasure he had all his life. My grandpa gave him a golden pocket watch with a golden chain, and my father held it in his room, in his hand, and he said, look, if you want this watch, let my daughter go. He said, just don't even turn your head. So he was really scared, that fellow, that young guy, you know. But he knew that Ukrainians were always accused of having had so many pogroms. You might say pogroms, because English language to me always starts with accent in the first syllable. Of course, it's syllable in my language. And so he just stood there dumbfounded like that. And my father looked at me. He took his lovely coat off.
This is the coat.
Saw there.
You see on the screen, that's the coat.
That's the coat. You see the little collar with fur? It was a really nice, warm coat. And he took his coat off and put it on my shoulders. Well, I was about the same, about this size. And I looked on the side of the column. The column was, say, this wide. And there were two women standing like this, just two of them, standing and watching us. And I was very curious to see why they were there. And there was a huge, big ball of the...
Like barbed wire?
Barbed wire, very thickly wrapped and thrown on the ground. And when I looked at that, I thought, oh, there is a hole there. I can jump and stand in a hole. Let's see what they do then. You know, and we were already moving toward this.
And did your father give you a signal? Did he tell you when to go?
No. I had to decide myself.
What's the last thing he said to you?
Oh, he said, do anything you want to do. What was the second thing he said to me? I'm thinking. It was very good. He said, just live. That's all.
And that's the last time you saw. That's the last time you saw your family, except for Frina.
Yeah.
That's the last time you saw your mother, your father, your grandparents.
Everyone, all those people. And I jumped out, and I stood there as though somebody dug my feet into the hole. And I watched how fast they're going. I knew I would never see them again. I knew that. And it took a long time. I stood there and I finally started seeing farther and farther away. And I just stood there such a long time. I didn't know what I was going to do next.
We know now that the killing field where they were taken, a place called Drobytsky Yar, which is a sort of a junior version of Babi Yar. Babi Yar, 34,000 Jews were murdered in Babi Yar. Still the most iconic, the largest and most iconic slaughter in the Ukraine. Drobytsky Yar, 16,000 were slaughtered. And that's where her family perished. After she escaped, she went back to her hometown, Kharkov, and to Kharkov. And there she knocked on doors until she found somebody willing to take her in. It was the parents of a classmate of hers that she did not know very well. You see there on the right, that's the Bogansha family.
Yes.
The young man is Nikolai. That's her classmate when she was in Kharkov, like in their equivalent of middle school. They let her in at great peril to themselves. They were not Jewish, they were Ukrainians. And there she stayed for 2 weeks. Now somehow, to this day, we don't know, I don't know, only her husband knows for sure, somehow Frina escaped too. We do know that it was only about a mile from Drobytsky Yar when my mother escaped. In any case, Frina made her way back to Kharkov as well. And ultimately, the sisters were united in the home of the Boganshas. And there they stayed for 2 weeks. And because it was too dangerous for them to stay there, too dangerous for any of them, for the girls or the family, that the Bogansha family helped them concoct a new names and new life story. They were no longer Zhanna and Frina Arshanskaya. They became Anna Marina Morozova. They hoped to hide out in an orphanage until the end of the war. Unfortunately, while they were in the orphanage, a piano tuner came there and heard them play and insisted they had to come into town to join a musical troupe there in occupied Kremenchug, a musical troupe of Ukrainians who had been put together by the Germans to entertain the troops. He insisted they come, and it would have been too suspicious for them not to, so they did. And they came to join this musical troupe. There's a picture of the troupe in the very middle, looking to the side. You'll see, that's my mother, looking askant, looking to the side, trying to hide her identity, or not to be noticed. Rather a futile attempt there, but she's the only one not looking at the camera, and but that is why she's looking sideways. There, they spent a year and a half, she and her sister. She performed for the hullfuls of German soldiers. She and her sister were often summoned to the private quarters of Gestapo and German officers and field generals to dine with them. And then afterwards, they would play for them. They would visit these same officers who would dine with them very decorously and politely, and then listen to their music. We'd go out the next day and commit these horrible slaughters. My question is, how did you feel playing for the enemy, and did you feel you were betraying the memory of your mother and your father when you were playing for these men?
Never. You cannot betray me from my parents. They will always be with me. It's impossible. I care so much that life is different without them. We need them. You need them.
These officers, when they heard you play, you'd say their favorite phrase when you would play a piece, their favorite play, when you ended, what would they say?
No mal.
Again.
No mal.
Again. And
once more.
And so as the war ended, and not ended, I shouldn't say ended, but when the Germans were retreating from Ukraine in 1943, they took you and Frina with them to Berlin. And you went to Berlin, you were taken to Berlin, and you arrived in Berlin in November 1943, about the time the Allied bombing started. And you were in Berlin for almost the rest of the war. You were sent out, you entertained the Germans there, and you were sent out to slave worker camps in Germany and in Czechoslovakia to entertain slave workers. And then at the end of the war, left Berlin right before the Red Army got to Berlin, and you went to Munich, where you were ultimately sent to a displaced persons camp, one of the many hundreds of displaced persons camps. One time when you were putting on a show for your fellow refugees to keep them entertained, one man who was standing in the back of the hall was the head of the camp. His name was Larry Dawson. He was the head of the camp, And he was, by the way, this is some of your get-up during the war when you were entertaining. They learned to play the accordion. They sang folk songs. They did a lot of this when they were sent out to the slave worker camps. But they went. This is the man, Larry Dawson, who was the head of the displaced person. This particular camp. He was a music lover from Charlottesville, Virginia. He heard them play, and he became so enchanted with their playing that he approached them and he persuaded them that he must come to America and go to the Juilliard. Well, they didn't know what the Juilliard was, but they did know what America was, and so they were all for that. Although my mother will tell you that she really did want to go back to the Soviet Union. Yeah. The only reason she didn't, so they ended up on that boat to America. Larry Dawson got them at that boat to America. They were on the first ship of Holocaust survivors to reach the U.S. after the war in May 1946. They were the only two Russians. But before the last performance they played before leaving for America was for 2,000 survivors of Dachau. How do you feel you played? How would you grade your performance that night?
Well, for what it was not just good enough, but it was good. I wouldn't have played it if it weren't the situation. But I would have been willing to play much worse. Those people were in my head, just got out of that hell. I mean, they were Jewish, but that's not necessary for me. If they weren't Jews, and I knew that they were tortured and everything, I would be anxious to do something for them. They were a wonderful audience, and I said to myself, forget the nervousness. You're just going to play, and this is not the time to be nervous. It's the time to play the best you can and just play.
And did you think about your mother and father during that performance?
Well, of course. Not only mother and father, but the rest of the people. And the rest of the people is such a long list. So, what do we do about that?
That perhaps is a good place to stop, and a very small capsule of her story. We're going to answer some questions.